It's YouTube week here on the Rubin Report, and joining me today is the creator of the Roaming Millennial right here on YouTube. Roaming Millennial, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you because you're one of the people, I say this often, that every few months there's like a burst on Twitter where suddenly like 100 people will say to me in a week, you got to talk to this person, you got to talk to this person. So you got on my radar about 6 months or so ago. I'm glad we're finally doing this. Tell me, how did you get into the world of YouTube?
Well, it's actually something that I had never really planned on happening. I could have never imagined that, it's less than a year ago that I started my channel. I'd be here talking to you, but I just started. I made a video for a friend of mine, and I never actually thought about posting it to YouTube. But then, I've been following all these creators, you, Sargon, for a long time. So I sort of on a whim decided to start my own channel and start posting. And I started doing it pretty infrequently, maybe 2 videos a month. And then as I started to get more views and more subscribers, I started doing it more regularly, and here we are. Yeah, I never would have imagined this would happen.
Yeah, all right, pretty cool. So we're going to talk a lot about your channel and the issues that you care about and things like that. But first, for people who don't know who you have a really interesting background. You were born in Hong Kong and lived there for 5 years, and you're from a biracial family. So tell me a little bit about that.
I actually, I lived in Hong Kong for, I think I was about 10 when I moved, but yeah, you guys have done your homework. I'm impressed with that. Yeah.
All right, I'll give you a bonus 5 years. Now make this good.
So I grew up in Hong Kong. After that, moved to Shanghai, and eventually then London, Singapore, lived in Montreal too, where my mom's side of the family is from. I've kind of grown up all over before going to university in the States, and that's sort of where the roaming part of Roaming Millennial comes from.
Yeah, what's it like being a young kid moving to so many different countries and different parts of the world and having to go to different schools and learn different languages? You speak a whole bunch of languages, by the way.
Yeah, I speak quite a few. Sadly, not as fluent as I would like all of them to be, but it was actually a really great experience. And I think people sometimes ask me, why I have the views that I do, why I think the way that I do. And I think a lot of it does come from the way that I was raised, how I grew up, because it's something that to me is totally normal. It's the only way I know how to live, sort of, is, all this moving and being exposed to all these cultures. But it's something that, sometimes it was challenging having, I think I went to about 4 different high schools, but, I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Yeah, so what are the languages that you speak? I know English, French, I think Arabic, and I think there's more, right?
Yeah, so English and French. My mom's French Canadian. I speak some Cantonese and Mandarin, not as well as I would like to, sadly, since I moved from Hong Kong. They haven't really gotten a lot of practice, and then some Spanish and Arabic from college.
Yeah, so did you study Spanish and Arabic? Because none of the countries that you lived in, as far as I know, that is their mother tongue.
Yeah, so I only took about 1 semester of Spanish, and then I ended up working in Florida, which is where I got most of my practice. And then for Arabic, my minor was actually Middle East Studies in Arabic, so I took 2 years of that.
Yeah, which is a great segue to the fact that you were a political science major, correct?
That's right.
I too was a political science major, and it is very rare that I get to talk to somebody that was a political science major who's doing something in their life involving politics. Were you always interested in politics?
Yeah, I chose that major when I think I was 16, started university at 17, and since then it's always been something that interests me. But yeah, I wasn't aware that you did political science too, and I think a lot of people sort of rag on the major, but then when you look at people who are complaining about it, a lot of them don't actually end up going into politics. But I think it's a good thing to study if it's what you're interested in and it's what you plan on pursuing as a career.
Yeah, and look, even for people that aren't going to do something political like we do, just understanding the basic tenets of how a government is supposed to work, whether you're in Canada where you are or in the States here, just understanding the different powers and the role of government, all that stuff. It's like all the time I feel like I wish I could just teach people just like the basics so that we don't have to repeat them all the time. Do you find you have to do that, like a lot of remedial stuff, so that you can get to the issues that you really care about?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something that I wish was covered more in high schools and, middle schools, especially since, it affects so much of our lives. How can we, as voters, vote for issues we care about if we don't actually sort of understand how everything works, how the system functions? And when I was in college, I was a TA, and I found, there were a lot of gaps, even among political science majors, and just how the government works that wasn't really, I guess, covered when they were in high school.
Yeah. So I think our politics kind of line up in a lot of ways. Probably not in every way, but what are like the key issues for you? I've got a list here of a couple things I want to ask you, but before I even hit them, what are just like the main things that interest you in the political space?
You know, it's funny, when I was in university, political science major, I was so into economics and foreign policy. Those were really what I was passionate about. Since then, I think, like you've probably noticed, things have really shifted towards more of the cultural sphere. So now, now it's things like free speech, sort of racial issues to gender issues, and that's sort of what I've focused mainly on my channel. But there is that other side of me that's just sort of this policy wonk that wants to talk about taxes and business regulations and stuff like that.
Yeah, so let's do the first part of that first. So the free speech stuff, people know I'm basically a free speech absolutist. The only thing that I wouldn't think is, or I wouldn't deem is okay, is if you directly call for violence to somebody. But beyond that, you can say whatever you like. Is that basically where you stand on that?
Definitely. And I've made videos about it on my channel, but I think it is sort of the most fundamental freedom that we have. It's what protects all of our other liberties. So I think the importance can't be stressed enough.
Yeah. So what is it then, as you are the roaming millennial? It seems to me that millennials actually, I think, are kind of treated unfairly by the media. And it's very easy to joke about millennials and all that. But a lot of the reasons that you can joke about them is because the people that came before them have kind of dropped the ball on a lot of this stuff. But it does seem to me that millennials are not getting it when it comes to free speech. That they are, and we know all the stuff, of course, about the safe spaces and the trigger warnings and deplatforming people and what happened at Berkeley and all that stuff. How did that snowball into something that seems really dangerous right now?
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that millennials are probably the most entitled generation that we've ever seen. I mean, mine is a generation that has grown up where literally the biggest problem we have to worry about is whether someone has offended us or hurt our feelings. And I think that's sort of what's caused this. This whole social justice crusade, it's sort of become our Cold War. It's the only thing really that we have left to complain about, I guess. The fact that someone has upset us or said something we don't like. And, it's too bad. And I think that part of it stems from a lack of education, the sort of the dangers that have come from these sort of censorship efforts.
When did you wake up to that stuff, like that, oh, if I'm offended, it's not the worst thing in the world, or that I don't have to deplatform or silence someone, or that I could actually use my own free speech to counter their speech?
So when did I become woke? Is that?
When did you? Woke has been a theme in all of these YouTube. It's like such a cliche phrase, but I do get why people say them. Yeah, when did you become woke?
Well, I think it's something that, the way I grew up, it was never, I don't know, your feelings sort of were never something that really factored into it. I don't know if it's because I grew up overseas or because, my families and schools were never really into that social justice thing. But it's something that when I got to university, I was pretty much hearing for the first time, and I was shocked just because it was at that time so foreign to me. It wasn't something that I had ever heard before. So, sort of hearing it for the first time, it's not that I was ever for it. It's just that I wasn't really necessarily aware that it was even a problem before I went to university and began seeing all of these, anti-hate speech laws, these social justice efforts that I did my freshman year at University of Southern California. And of course, they were very popular there.
Yeah, one of the scary things that's happening in Canada right now is this Islamophobia law that I guess passed 81 to 0. Is that right?
Yeah, it's pretty scary.
Yeah, so can you just unpack that a little bit, like actually what was voted on and what do you think that actually means?
Well, I mean, it's supposed to be an anti-Islamophobia law. They're not saying that the effort is censorship, but Canada has for a long time had a very strong bent against what they label as hate speech. But the thing is, hate speech is so poorly defined. Like this bill specifically, it bans Islamophobia, but the way that speech that sort of encourages Islamophobia or is representative of it. But, the way that manifests is so general and broad, is, saying something like we should, I don't know, deport all Muslims. I mean, I think most people would agree that would, I guess, qualify under Islamophobia. What about, general criticisms of Islam as an ideology, though? That's where things are sort of less clear even in the law itself, and I think that's why so many people, myself included, are very scared about it. Because I mean, like I said before, for a while now Canada has been going down this path, implementing more and more sort of hate speech or censorship laws. And my fear is that pretty soon we'll end up like Germany one day, where there'll be police teams breaking down your door for Facebook posts.
Yeah, and I know that kind of stuff, it sounds alarmist when you say it, and I know you're not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but everything kind of takes time. How much of this is just the theme, which I've been talking about for 2 years, and I know you and others have talked about, that people can't separate ideas versus people? So that, to me, the word Islamophobia is a ridiculous word, because you're not afraid, Islam is just a set of ideas. Nobody's afraid of a set of ideas. You're afraid of the practices that might take place as a consequence of those ideas, which would treat gays poorly or other minorities or women, et cetera, et cetera. But being afraid of that is not a phobia. Those are rational fears versus the average nominal Muslim person, like my friend Ali Rizvi, who lives up there in Canada, who's trying to sort of reform the religion from the inside and isn't a believer of anything that he can't prove and that kind of thing. And that there are millions and millions of these people. But the ideas and people thing, a lot of people are just never going to get it, right?
That's so right. And, it's the same, like, you can't criticize segments of Islam without, in their minds, the regressive mentality criticizing all Muslims. It's like how you can't criticize feminism without them thinking you're sexist for, in their minds, speaking against women. And it's this idea that people are their identities. If you criticize something about Islam, it's like you're criticizing all Muslims as people, which I think is ridiculous, especially people like you or me who might have some issues with parts of Islam. I don't think any of us are saying that we should ban the religion as a practice, or that we should have these anti-Muslim laws. It is nothing like that. But I think it's the fact that we're no longer even able to talk about these issues without being labeled a bigot or anything like that. I think it, in the long run, is just going to be more damaging to these communities, because they are actual problems that need to be addressed. And I don't think defending Islamic extremism does any help to the average, everyday Muslim who just wants to live a peaceful life.
Yeah, and it's that soft bigotry of low expectations that actually does damage to them, right? Because doesn't that ultimately make it so that not only can't people like us talk about it without feeling some sort of backlash, and you're in Canada where they just passed this ridiculous law, but then it makes it harder for their own reformers to talk about it, and then people like Majid Nawaz will be labeled an anti-Muslim extremist by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the guy is doing, I think he's one of the most brave people on planet Earth.
Mm-hmm. And it's too bad, because even you look at people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who have experience with this extremism, and who actually who want to change things for the better for people who still do identify as Muslims, and who want to for example, protect Muslim women in these communities, and they're labeled all these awful things. And in the end, they're not helping anybody. All they're doing is protecting these dangerous segments.
Yeah. Do you think we're starting to win this? This has been one of the through lines through all the people I'm talking to on YouTube Week, and generally my guests, that I think there's been some wins finally over the last couple of months against the bigoteer thing and the SJWs and all that. Do you sense the tide turning? I mean, I know more and more people are coming to people like us about this stuff, but that doesn't mean that they're weakening in and of itself.
No, I definitely think that things are starting to change, and the longer I've had my channel, the more I think I've come to realize that, these social justice warriors, I don't know if they were ever actually the majority so much as a very vocal and well-positioned minority. And I think what I love so much about this skeptic community, whatever you want to call it, is that it's not even a left versus right thing anymore. There are tons of people who are speaking out about these issues from all sides of the political spectrum, and it's really just a sort of basic freedom, classical liberal issue. And I think people, especially people my age, I think my main demographic is between 18 to 35. They're beginning to, I don't know if it's sort of pushed back, because I think a lot of them were never necessarily for it, but they're beginning to become more vocal about it, which I think is great.
Yeah. Are there any political leaders, either in Canada or in the States, that you look at and go, wow, this guy or this girl, like they really get it. They get the principles that we should be fighting for, and it's not pandering to the SJWs, and at the same time, it's not based in bigotry. Is there anyone that really understands this stuff that's running?
That's a hard question. I don't think that It's been a long time since I saw a politician and I was like, wow, you really get it. I think the last politician I sort of threw my entire like enthusiastic support behind was Paul Ryan, and he's ended up disappointing me. But I'm a big fan of people like Ben Carson. People who stand for just general principles of small government, who aren't afraid of standing up to people who might otherwise call them a bigot. People who sort of don't fit the regressive mold of who they think, maybe conservatives should be, tend to get, I think, the most backlash. People like Ben Carson, or even here on YouTube, Blair White. And so I really admire them for sticking to their principles regardless.
Yeah, and we're seeing more and more people like this, people who break the traditional mold of, the way they would want a black person to think, which that's actually bigotry, because I believe that black people, like white people and Asian people and every other people, can have a complete diversity of thought.
It's almost as if race doesn't define your character. Strange.
I think we got the quote for the episode. There you go. It's almost as if, exactly. Almost as if. So you mentioned Paul Ryan. You actually worked on the campaign for his running mate, or I guess he was the second on the ticket, but for Mitt Romney. Were you an intern on the campaign, or what did you do?
Actually, I interned. It was after his VP run with Mitt Romney. I interned in his DC office for a semester, which was an interesting experience, and when I learned that I would never want to become a politician.
So what about it? What about it being so close to that? Because I remember when I studied politics, I wanted to be a politician at first. And it was through studying political science that I thought, wow, this system is so screwed up. I don't know that I would ever want to be in it on that level. I like to think I'm doing something good on this level. But what was it being around it that pushed you out?
Well, I think I was very young when I was there. I was 19, interning in a DC office, and a pretty high profile one. And I think I went in very optimistic. I was like, oh, I'm going to go help, and we're going to write these amazing laws and, really help people. I'm going to be, involved in the process of government. And I think when you're actually there, you realize that nothing ever really changes the day to day. Nothing really gets done. There's just a lot of political maneuvering. There's really very little work on actual policy. And also, I was also a little bit disillusioned about just, the relationship between constituents and the actual office. You sort of think of these people as being there to represent their districts. But the amount of sort of, communication that goes on between the constituents and the representative, it's very low. You sort of just, you get all these mails and these letters from people, all these phone calls, but you can't really log all of them. You can't really take all of them into consideration. I was just sort of very disillusioned by the whole thing. And especially I was there during the government shutdown, which was a harrowing experience. But I think I just sort of, I was disillusioned by the whole thing.
Yeah. Is Paul Ryan as close to a functioning classical liberal as we can get? I think he's a little more on the libertarian side. I know he really likes the Ayn Rand stuff. But is there anyone that's a little closer to what would be really a classical liberal in the government? I
think probably someone like Rand Paul would be closer than Paul Ryan, in my opinion. Paul Ryan, what drew me to him in the first place was sort of his work on the budget. Like I said, I was really into the budget when I was 19 for some reason.
How does a 19-year-old get into the budget? I don't think that's ever been said before in the history of the world.
I just always had a thing for fiscal conservatism. What can I say? But that was really what excited me about the whole thing. And I was actually there for the whole ACA rollout, which was exciting, I guess. I got to attend a lot of those briefings with Secretary Sebelius. But I think Paul Ryan, he's more of a, fiscal conservative than an actual libertarian or classical liberal. I think, if you're looking for that, I would say someone more like Rand Paul.
Yeah. Is that a kind of disappointing way to have to look at politics then, that, Rand Paul is probably the closest. He's certainly the closest thing to a true libertarian, even though he in himself, I think, has some conflicting views on things. Gay marriage, for example, he sort of had to be dragged to it, even though you can make a very simple libertarian argument for gay marriage and that the government shouldn't be involved in that contract. But what does that say about the state of that he was basically, he ran for president, but after the first, I think it was the straw poll, he was out. So that kind of sucks at the political level, right?
It does. And I think I've said this before on my channel. I don't think that Trump necessarily won so much as he beat out the other candidates. It's not that all these people, I supported Trump versus Hillary Clinton, but I don't think he was necessarily the perfect candidate. Not that I don't wish him the best in his presidency, but I think his win was sort of symbolic of the fact that most other politicians are just disappointing. I don't, I don't think there's a more optimistic way to paint it than that.
Yeah, is part of it that they are just politicians. So I think oddly what's now playing to Trump's strength is he's starting to do some of the things that he said he was going to do. Now, you may disagree with those things. You may not want him to do those things, but he's not treating this as a politician would, where you just say something and then don't do it or are beholden to the lobbyists. He's treating it as a businessman who has sort of laid out what I'm going to do, and now a businessman has to go ahead and actually do it.
And I think it's funny how shocked people are that he's actually doing what he said he was going to do. And I think that sort of is symbolic of how corrupt and sort of inefficient the whole political system has become. When a politician actually promises something and then delivers, it shocks us. The media can't believe that he's actually doing all the things that he said he was going to do. And even myself, I've sort of been wondering if Trump hasn't been, managed to do all these things with only about a month in office, not, again, whether you disagree with them or not, the fact that he's managed to at least get things started, it sort of makes me wonder, what have these other presidents been doing, their first 100 days of office? Even I don't think they've managed to put as many things on the books as he has.
So that's an interesting spot to be in, because you're obviously a limited government person and a classical liberal libertarian person and a Rand Paul person, yet Trump has done a lot of this stuff via executive action. So you can't be happy about that, right?
Right, and that's actually something that I've mentioned before. I'm glad that Trump is taking the initiative, but at the same time, something that I didn't like about the Obama presidency was his fondness for executive orders. I don't think president should be legislating from the executive office. That's not what the president's office is for. An argument that I've heard from Trump supporters is that, well, he's just trying to undo what Obama has done. And I think, yeah, that's true. But at the same time, we have a Republican Congress right now. There's no reason why Trump can't work with Congress to get things done, the proper way, or, to at least do things, without just sort of making himself king through all these executive orders.
Yeah. So what do you think that says about the system? Because I'm completely with that. And there you can find me writing about things where I was against executive actions when George W. Bush did it. I was against them when Obama did it. I was against them now. But I understand there is some use for them at some level, but they shouldn't be legislating through the executive branch. But what does it say if he has Congress and he's not going through Congress and Congress isn't even forcing him? What does that say about just the state of our democracy?
Well, I think the first thing is that, having to push something through Congress, it takes a very long time, both houses, and it has to go through committee. As any poli-sci major knows, or anyone who's seen Schoolhouse Rock, it's not a fast process to get something passed. And I think, even if we do have, Republican majorities in both houses, even the Republican Party is not that unified right now. If you just listen to things like what John McCain says about Trump. So I think the first thing is that it's just a very complicated system. It takes a long time. And I think it's sort of a necessity when you have a country as large as the United States, all these different competing interests. If something were to be passed too quickly, I think it would sort of indicate a one-party system, which isn't good either, right? We don't want there to be zero opposition, just everyone can, do whatever they want. The president's say is pretty much law, but at the same time, I think it is representative of how still divided the nation is, even, within the Republicans or even within the Democrats.
Yeah, so where does that leave us with the Democrats? Because it's very clear to me that they are never going to vote for anything he does. They're never going to vote for any of his appointees. They're going to try to now take down Jeff Sessions. They already got rid of Flynn. I think this is all leading to them trying to figure out how to impeach him. And some of them are being very vocal about that. Maxine Waters basically said, we're going to try to figure out how to do it. I mean, that's not democratic. Now, I get it. The Republicans didn't want to play ball with Obama, and Obama actually wasn't great about, and a lot of people have said this, he wasn't great about getting, behind closed doors and trying to negotiate, as opposed to somebody like Bill Clinton, who was known to love the political game, love doing that, that arguing and getting to a resolution. But what does it say if the Democrats just simply won't be part of the democratic process and are only going to be part of the hashtag resistance?
I think it's sort of disappointing, especially like you said, Republicans didn't want to cooperate with Obama, but I think there's a difference between not wanting to cooperate with someone and then actively trying to remove them from their elected office, right? I think it's fine to oppose Trump's policies, but when you have people, sort of admitting that the end goal is to remove him from office, I think that takes things to a whole new level, and I think it undermines the legitimacy of his president. But actually, I was, his joint session speech, I was actually sort of impressed about how many issues he mentioned that typically have only been Democratic issues. Things, things like more programs for people who are addicted to drugs, things like that. Paid leave for families for, childcare, things like that, or even, prison reform. So I'm hoping when it comes to these issues, things that typically the Democrats have, sort of spearheaded over the Republicans, I'm hoping that they will, at least for those issues, want to work together, right? Because I mean, I can understand them, not wanting to co-sign on the wall or things like that, but I'm hoping it's not something that's going to be happening across the board for every single issue. I think there are still issues where Republicans and Democrats don't really see that differently.
Yeah, it's funny, during the speech to Congress, he did throw a couple bones to them, as you're saying, things that traditionally a Republican president wouldn't say, but they really weren't even applauding those things. So I suspect that they're not going to play ball on anything until the public starts going, wait a minute, maybe he isn't a crazy right-wing extremist or Hitler or any other things that they've painted him as. Again, I say that as someone that has plenty of issues with him, and I don't want an endlessly powerful executive branch. But I think that maybe the Democrats would come along once they realize their constituents are going, wait a minute, you guys are purely playing politics, and he's actually trying to do some things that are a little more moderate.
Yeah, and I really do hope that's the case, because I think the average American, whether they voted for Trump or not, at the end of the day, does just want things to run smoothly in government, especially when you're looking at these issues that are pretty much, I think, bipartisan issues, right? Everybody wants prison reform. Everybody wants, I mean, whether or not you're in favor of the drug war specifically, you want more treatment programs, especially we have this heroin epidemic that's going on. So, I hope the average everyday person does attempt to let their congressman know. Whether or not they would actually get the message, I think is questionable, but at least does try to, raise the fact that, yeah, he's president, like it or not, I still want these issues addressed by my representative.
Yeah. Is there anything going on up in Canada that's a little more functional that maybe we can borrow from you guys that we don't know about?
Well, I mean, I'm actually really not a fan of the parliamentary system. There's less of a separation of powers than there is in the United States, because, the leader of the party is the executive. And I'm really not the biggest Justin Trudeau fan, especially, everything that's happening right now. I'm not sure about that. I'm really interested to see what what the whole NAFTA negotiation is gonna amount to, though.
Yeah. Where does the media fit into all of this? Because the reason that I know about you is through social media, and it seems like there's this massive rise of these people now. That there's this rise of people just doing it on their own, trying to tell the truth the best they can. None of us are perfect. We all screw up. I have no problem admitting it when I do screw up. But that for those of us that are doing this, we're actually in many cases doing a better job than the mainstream media. Do you feel that?
I definitely feel that. I mean, I know personally, I'd be more likely to go on, I don't know, somewhere like Drudge and try to see what's going on than I would be to, tune into CNN. Especially, we have documented instances of the media, if not outright lying, then, twisting stories, failing to report on events, sort of lying by omission. And, people, I think a lot of people like to, in the media themselves, they like to label people who are critical of them as these alarmists or conspiracy theorists. But I don't think it's about that. I think, we live in the information age right now, where, everyone has access to pretty much the entire world, and it's great. But at the same time, I think the media is realizing right now that it's sort of pushing them into a corner. We're no longer reliant on them to get our news, right? I mean, if we want to hear what Trump says, he's tweeting all the time, and I think he's used that a little bit more often than his PR people would probably want him to. I'm sure he's given them a lot of work to do with everything he's been tweeting. But I think it's great that we're no longer in a position where we just have to accept what they say and take it as fact, because we can check ourselves. People are able to access information firsthand, and I think it's great.
Yeah. What about the risk in that too? That this is a beautiful thing, but the barrier to entry is pretty low. Both of us were able to, if we only had webcams and an internet access wherever we were, we could do this. So anyone could do this. Anyone that wants to put out misinformation, that wants to just do clickbait and all that stuff, that makes it a little harder to pilfer truth, doesn't it?
Right, but I mean, I guess the argument that would sort of stem from that is that there would be less misinformation if we just relied on the mainstream media, which we see is not the case. So, there's misinformation from independent media, but there's misinformation from the mainstream media too. I mean, I think no matter where you get your news sources from, you have to think critically and sort of try and see where they're getting their sources from, and whether it's actual news or just commentary that they're offering. But I think, I wouldn't necessarily say that CNN or Huffington Post is any more infallible than something like Rebel Media. Both are not perfect, both are not biased.
Yeah, I think Rebel Media is doing a pretty good job from everything I've seen. And I had Lauren Southern from Rebel on the show last week. For you personally, to talk about some of these things, now I'm with you on most of this stuff, obviously, but these are thought of as controversial things, especially if you talk to a lot of people on the left about them. What kind of backlash do you get? Especially because you yourself are a millennial. So and you're white, if I'm not mistaken, or at least half white. So when you're white and a girl and a millennial and all of these, all these words that I only judge you for your thoughts, but when you are all of these things, what kind of backlash do you get?
Well, it's funny. I actually remember the first time I got a negative comment on my channel, and I was so shocked. I was like, "How could they say that?" Like, it was so mean. And if you're
the good old days,
not,
right?
Right, yeah, and if you're not on the internet, or I didn't even have social media before I started my channel. It's really shocking that people could say those kinds of things. But of course now it's like, oh, I got called a Nazi. What else is new? And yeah, I mean, I think there are a small group of people out there who think that anyone who doesn't sort of toe the social justice line is a white supremacist and a Nazi. And then, lately I've actually been getting backlash from the other side of things where, I've been accused of things like promoting the white genocide and stuff like that from all these white nationalists. And I think it's something that I would like to say the internet is responsible for, this sort of trolling culture, but I think it's been around forever. People, there are extremists out there, there are trolls and jerks out there, and it's just sort of something that we have to deal with. And I think as someone who is a millennial speaking out about these things, I think I do sort of, anyone who, I guess, is not the stereotypical old white man that they would expect to have a more conservative viewpoint may get a little bit more backlash. But I think it's also important in that case to show these people that these views aren't, in the main, in the fringe. These are very common ideas that anyone, regardless of their age, gender, or race, can have.
Yeah, and we're clearly seeing these ideas bubble up to the mainstream finally. So for all of us that have been talking about this stuff for a while, it's actually kind of gratifying when it finally bubbles its way up to the New York Times or wherever, and you're like, yeah, this is what I've been talking about for 2 years now. So another thing that you do on your channel is interviews, and you've had a bunch of some of my favorite people and people that I've had sit across from me right here, including Dennis Prager and Christina Hoff Sommers, and who else have we both had on together? There's others.
Dr. Peterson, I think, and I'm not
Jordan
sure if
Peterson.
You've had Michael Shermer, but I had him on as well. Yeah.
Yeah, Peterson and Shermer. What do you like doing the one thing more than other? Like, do you like going right to the camera and just getting your stuff out there, or do you like doing the interviews more, or are you just kind of mixing it up and figuring out what you want to do?
Well, I mean, I'm definitely, not a journalist. I'm not a professional interview. I'm no Dave Rubin, definitely. But
am I a professional? All right.
Yeah, I think you definitely are. I think you do a great job. And the sort of, the first person I ever had on my channel was Dr. Peterson because of the whole gender issue. And I just sort of on a whim asked if he was free for an interview. He said yes. And then since then, I've, admittedly just sort of exploited my channel as a means to talk to all these people I really admire under the guise of interviewing them. So it's been really great for me, and it's really humbling to get to talk to these people one-on-one and ask them the questions that I've always wondered, even questions that my audience gives me. It's something that I definitely plan on doing in the future, but I'm also very aware of the fact that I'm not a professional journalist or interviewer or anything. It's just it's sort of my opportunity to pick their brains and ask them the things I've always wondered.
Yeah. Is YouTube your full-time gig?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is, which is amazing, and I'm so lucky.
What was that like? Like the day that actually happened, how did that feel?
Well, it was something that sort of happened gradually. It's something that I think after maybe 5 months of my channel running, I started to actually see money from it. Like my videos were monetized, and I was like, oh, I'm actually earning from this. And then I started a Patreon, and I think without Patreon, I wouldn't be able to have this as my full-time job. And it was it's something that at first I was like, oh, maybe, and then, but I didn't do it right away, and then I just sort of like waited to see how the numbers were going, and like, if can I live off of this? And yeah, it's something that I, after a couple months, sort of like it would be cool, but I didn't actually want to say like, oh, I hope to someday be a full-time YouTuber, because I mean, it sounds like this crazy dream, but the fact that it's actually happening, it's crazy.
So you mentioned Patreon there, and everyone knows that I'm on Patreon, and as we're doing this YouTube week, I had Colin Moriarty from Kind of Funny Videos, and they're crushing it on Patreon. We kind of molded our Patreon launch after them. How important is Patreon to you? And I don't mean it just on the financial side, but for us, for example, I have a couple thousand people that support us, and I don't even know what their political beliefs are. So even if I wanted to sell out to them, I wouldn't even know what they think. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. I have to be beholden only to my own brain. Do you feel the same way?
Definitely, it's such a blessing that it exists, and that people are so ready to support creators that they're passionate about. I think kickstarting or crowdfunding, I think a lot of people see it as this idealism and over optimistic, that people would actually just donate willingly things that they want to support. But I think the fact that people like you and me are able to use it so effectively really goes to show that if people care about something, they will support it financially. And especially for me, I've had, I think it's 3 or 4 videos demonetized, and if I were just sort of reliant on ad revenue, it would mean that I wouldn't be able to talk about some things that I would like to talk about, things, like migrants, Muslim immigration, or just, Islamic extremism, things like that are what I've noticed tend to get demonetized the most. But the fact that Patreon is there means that I'm able to explore issues that I really care about, but that YouTube may not want to support me on. And so
Yeah.
it is really freeing. And especially, like, I have my Patreon, or my patrons actually vote on, whatever topics they want to see next as one of the rewards for supporting me. And it's funny because, I've noticed on my channel, throughout the videos that I've posted, that some topics tend to definitely do more than others. Anything that's more related to feminism, or more topical things like, I don't know, the culture wars, those always tend to do really well. But at the same time, I'm also interested in, these more policy heavy issues, things like immigration, minimum wage, stuff like that. And the fact that I have these patrons who do care about the same issues means that I'm not, views are obviously still really important if you want to be a YouTuber, but I can also explore things that kind of are more niche, that are more specific to my interests, where if I were just, going off of whatever gets the most views, I wouldn't necessarily be able to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I totally hear you, because we've been demonetized on a couple of videos on similar topics, and it allows you to go ahead and do what you think is right. And as you said, maybe some of more niche stuff that maybe isn't going to garner the views that, SJW stuff or whatever else might get. So you mentioned immigrants and the migrants and that whole thing. And I know you've done a bunch of videos on that. And you, as an immigrant, and as someone that you weren't an economic migrant as a 5 or 10-year-old bouncing around the world, but as someone that's lived in a bunch of places and now is living in Canada and may move to the States and all that. What's your basic take on what's going on with the immigrants and the migrants, whatever you want to call them at this point?
Well, something that I've noticed from, watching the news, listening to these presidential debates, or just seeing what people who are more aggressive on the issue talk, it seems like the word immigrant has been synonymous with illegal immigrant or refugee, which is definitely not the case. I got my green card through neither of those means. I applied legally, I'm not a refugee. And I think when people do speak out about issues like the refugees or illegal immigration, it's very common that they're labeled xenophobic. And I think that, like the inability to criticize Islam, I think it's just a way of shutting down the conversation. And from the people who I've spoken with who share the same views as me towards refugees, and, sort of more I guess critical of the whole vetting process and its efficacy and wanting to secure the border. I don't remember any of them saying anything along the lines of no immigrants at all, just shut the border down, no one's allowed in. And I think the fact that people are trying to paint it that way, as if either you want to take all the refugees or you're just this isolationist, like either you love illegal immigrants or you're a white nationalist who doesn't want anyone coming in. I think it's a way of poisoning the well. It's a way of shutting down actual conversation.
Yeah, and nobody's doing this conversation well, right? Or at least in the public space. There's some people online that I think are talking about it in a mature way, just like you laid out there. But it almost seems like nobody is, and even when Trump, I think, says things that make sense, saying we have to have borders, which is that's not a controversial statement. Every country exists because they have to protect their own citizens, which means you have your borders. Whether a wall is smart or economically viable or will be effective, those are all legit questions. But I find that even when he says, let's take care of the border and then we can figure out the other pieces, that the responses to even that are hysterical. And that's just where we can't get anyone to then how do you then make an honest proposal?
Well, it's hard because this, I think, maybe more than any other topic, is such an emotional one. People point to the poor and hungry in other countries, and they say, "Well, you're saying no to these people? You would turn away these families?" And there's this impression among a lot of people, I think, that the immigration program should be this international welfare program where you just import everyone who's in economic despair. And I was criticized once. I was having a conversation with someone, and I was talking about skills-based immigration, point systems like Australia or Canada might have, where you sort of look at, okay, what's your employment history, what kind of education do you have, what languages do you speak, how likely are you to assimilate to the culture, and you sort of base it off that. And he was like, oh, what, so you want to discriminate toward the educated and the wealthy and the young and the healthy for your immigration system? And I was like, yes, but I think we should want immigrants who have the biggest chance of being successful, in the country. And for some reason, that's become this really controversial opinion to have. And it's because people want to treat immigration, like I said, like a welfare program, like this humanitarian project.
So do you think something's different than, say, 80 or 90 years ago when we had tremendous, maybe even longer than that, 100 years ago, when the United States had tremendous immigration from parts of Europe where we did want, what's the phrase? We want your tired, your masses, your poor. You're saying that actually at the moment wouldn't be the right thing to do because maybe we just can't, it's a different country right now. Do you make a distinction there?
Right, and I think a lot of it has to do with what the American economy looks like right now. If you look at something like what was going on, I don't know, in the 20s, we were going through this whole massive industrialization where we needed labor, we needed workers. Right now, it's sort of the opposite. American manufacturing is really not so hot right now. We need skills workers. We need, STEM professionals. There isn't this huge demand for sort of blue collar workers in the United States right now. So I think the immigration program needs to reflect the American economy. And right now, I'm sorry to say, but the American economy does not need more blue collar workers. We don't need more manufacturers. We don't need things like that. And I think bringing in these people without a consideration of what kind of jobs are available is just setting them up for failure. Inviting people over when there are no jobs available, even for native citizens in the same position, it's just going to end in disaster.
Yeah, so that argument you're making is completely, has nothing to do with culture or religion or anything like that. But what about the other piece, the cultural and religious piece of this, that we could do one at a time. So just culturally, forgetting religion, we don't have to even make this about Islam, but if you take any people from a different culture where they treat women differently or gay people differently or other religious minorities differently, and just putting them here in our melting pot, maybe wouldn't work these days. And it partly wouldn't work because of the SJW left that would keep entrenching them in ideas of being the other and all of that.
Right, and I think, the idea that you can invite someone over and have them assimilate to your culture, I think it can work, but it can't work if you bring over a huge enough number of them where they can form their own communities and not have to even learn the language to be able to function, which is, what we see happening in Sweden and Germany. There are migrants there who, because there are so many other, refugees or migrants living with them, that they don't actually have to interact with the native population at all, which, obviously that's not going to lead to assimilation. That's one thing. And the second thing is, when you treat the situation as we have to adapt to their culture rather than the other way around, I think you're just asking for what's happening right now, which is in Europe, the Islamification of these communities. We're not expecting them to assimilate. We're not asking them to assimilate. So obviously they're not going to. And I think we can't act surprised when there are these huge no-go zones that are totally, pretty much little Syria, because it's what we let it happen.
So what do we do about sort of the virtue signaling Hollywood elite people? I know all that sounds like a right-wing conspiracy to even say those phrases, but all of these people that are always telling you how much they want open the borders and we want everybody and blah blah blah. It's like, I live in LA. The amount of houses here that are guarded by gates and cameras and that have security and all of this other stuff. I don't see these people opening their doors and building houses where their pools are and all that to let these people in. So how do you deal with that kind of virtue signaling? Like, how do you actually take the power out of that?
Well, I think, obviously the best option would be to turn their mansions into migrant camps. I think that's something we can all get on board with. But no, seriously, I think, celebrities only have as much power as we give them. And I think if we stop treating people like J.K. Rowling as the moral authority on what to do with migrants, maybe she'll stop talking about it. And I think at the end of the day, the average person, the average person who's living in or is affected by these migrant communities in Sweden or, in the UK, or, even there are huge refugee populations in the US as well. I think we need to sort of raise their voices and listen to what they have to say, because they're really the people at the end of the day who are affected by this, right? The people living in Beverly Hills, they're probably never going to have to deal with the consequences of this. Like, A, they don't live near them, and B, they're not going to be in competition for the same jobs as these people, right? So obviously it's very easy for them to say, yeah, let them all in, because it's not going to affect their lives in any meaningful way. It's the people who are going to be affected that we should be paying attention to, not these celebrities.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned J.K. Rowling, because I think it's a good segue to something else. Because, she got into that big Twitter fight with Piers Morgan, as you probably saw, after he was on Real Time, and that comedian Jim Jeffries basically told him to go fuck himself after he said something about immigration. And I have never liked Piers Morgan. I did not like him as an interviewer. Subsequently, he's gotten into like a little bit of a public spat with my friend and mentor, Larry King. So this is not a person that I've ever liked nor said anything about, okay? But I watched that and I thought, he's calmly trying to lay out what the facts are here. The response to him is not only a comedian, instead of being funny, but just telling him to go fuck himself, but then J.K. Rowling and a whole bunch of the usual mob all just jumped in and started attacking Piers Morgan. And all he said, he didn't say anything racist. He didn't say anything bigoted. He basically just laid out some facts. So does that also go back to what you're saying, is we just have to stop giving these people power?
Right, and I think the whole thing with Piers Morgan, it's interesting, because like you, I don't even like Piers Morgan, but I actually, based off some of his tweets, had to say, well, he's right on this. I don't like the guy. I haven't liked him since he had his short-lived show on CNN, but yeah. I do think
he by the way, he retweeted me as my tweet said, I don't even like this guy, but I'm going to defend him, and he even retweeted that. So yeah. I actually kind of liked him after that, because it was like, oh, at least you have a sense of humor,
Yeah, but it's funny, like these people who are by no means these right-wing conservatives, even they're being attacked. Now, people like Piers Morgan for just not even really supporting Trump, because he says he's not a Trump supporter, and I haven't heard him say anything glowing about him, so I'll take him at his word for that. But even for just merely saying that it's not a Muslim ban, he gets attacked for it. And I think it's actually, I don't want to say great that it's happening, because obviously it's never fun to be sworn at on stage, but I think it does show people on the outside who are watching this unfold how sort of unreasonable these people are, and how they're so quick to turn on anybody who might question their narrative, even a little bit, even if it's one of their own, even if they're not fully supporting the other person, just by sort of, oh, by the way, it's not a Muslim ban. That's still apparently enough to get them to attack you.
It's so interesting, and that mode of maybe just kind of let them be because they'll implode on their own. I am coming around to that a bit, because did you even see in the last couple days after the speech to Congress that Trump gave, that Van Jones said he had his first presidential moment and that maybe we should give him a chance, et cetera, et cetera. Van Jones, who's a far left progressive black man. And Keith Olbermann then tweeted that Van Jones is a sellout. And then, of course, that got thousands of retweets. So it's like the left just keeps moving further to the left so that anyone who doesn't join them the second that they go there is now the bad guy. Thus, people like you and I are now white supremacist, neo-Nazi. What else are we?
A white supremacist, neo-Nazi, Islamophobe, racist, bigot,
We need
all
a jingle.
the good stuff.
Do we have a jingle or something? There's got to be a YouTuber that makes jingles on these things.
I feel like Chris Raygun would be a good person
I'm gonna talk to the Raygun on that.
Yeah. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, they are shooting themselves in the foot. I think most people out there are reasonable. And, even if they may not be conservatives, even if they may agree with aspects of social justice, just watching how regressive these people are becoming, how aggressive, how intolerant, it's not going to attract new people to support them.
Let's knock out a couple of the other key issues. So you've mentioned a few times that you're a policy wonk. You like the economic stuff. What's your thoughts basically on taxes? I can sense you're a limited government person. Is taxation theft, or is there a decent amount of taxes to make the state work that you're okay with?
Well, I mean, I'm not an anarcho-capitalist, so I do believe that a state should exist, and, that government does serve a legitimate purpose. I think taxation can be theft. I think taxation can also be charges for services rendered. For example, roads. I use the roads, therefore I think it's reasonable to expect me to pay for the road in taxes. But when it comes to things that are redistributive efforts, giant welfare programs, or even, international aid, I'm not a fan of that. I think when it's something that, people aren't receiving anything back for, where it's more social engineering or government humanitarian programs, which I don't think they have the authority to do, then I think you start to enter the realm where taxation is theft, because they're not providing you with anything. They're just, taking what you have and giving it to other people.
Yeah. So then what's a fair tax system? Would you be for basically a flat tax?
Well, in the glorious motherland Hong Kong, there is a flat tax of 15%, which I think works out very fairly, and we see Hong Kong has budget surpluses almost every year, and I think it goes to show, the fact that it's successful goes to show that it's, these huge deficits that the United States and other European countries are running. It's not necessarily that they're not taking in enough revenue, it's just that they're spending way too much.
Another one that you've talked about a bunch is school choice. And as I'm a local guy, I would always want to be governed more by people who are locally in my community, my local representative, my mayor, my governor, even more than my president and things at the federal level. I'm for school choice also. What's the controversial part of this? I've never really even understood the counter argument to this one.
Well, I very strongly support school choice. I support choice in anything, but especially, I mean, I don't have children, but as a parent, I can only imagine what it must be like to only, be told that, yes, your child will go to the school, regardless if it's a failing school, regardless, of how the teachers are performing, your child must go there. I can't imagine how powerless that must feel as a parent, to know your child is doing poorly in a failing school and not be able to do anything. From what I understand, the controversy surrounding charter schools is that they're not held to any standards, which I don't think is accurate. And I think people who support the idea of charter schools definitely do want them to be held accountable for how their students perform. I'm not really aware of any mainstream activists for charter schools who are saying, let us do whatever we want. You can't tell us what to do. Right.
Right. No one's creating charter schools and sending their kids to charter schools so that they can put them at a shitty school. That would be the reverse of what they're trying to accomplish.
And something else that I've heard is that it takes away funding from public schools. But I think the idea that the money follows the child really debunks that, right? Because if you're taking away the child from that school, then obviously the money that goes to support that child's education should not go to that school if the child's no longer there. It should follow the student. So I mean, I think a lot of why people are so against charter schools is because they think it will harm the public schools, from what I understand. But I think, well, A, public schools are already failing, and B, parents pay for their, even if you go to public school, parents are still paying for that. So I think you should definitely have the right to decide where your money goes to and where your child goes to.
Right. So for the people that would argue it would hurt the public schools, I went to public elementary, public middle, public high school. I went to a publicly funded state university in New York at Binghamton. So I'm a full state person, and I believe that funds should go to fund those things. I actually think that's one of the reasons we should be taxed. I guess the argument against that would be that if you have a school that's doing well, it's not going to be hurt, so that we would actually strengthen the strong public schools, and eventually you'd weed out the bad ones and they would have to be replaced by something better.
Right, and I think competition is always a good thing, and I think if public schools or charter schools, any school in general, have to compete to get students and therefore funding, it's only going to lead to improved education. I don't see how someone can argue that more choice, more competition will lead to worse education.
Yeah,
Also,
there's probably a whole other economic argument that people would have with you on that, but I don't see it myself.
And I mean,
right,
it's also not like these charter schools are popping up because the public school system is just flourishing and doing so well, right?
Right, that's a good point. If they were doing great, then there would be no need for any of this stuff. Okay, so one more for you. So now that you fully make your living on YouTube and it's going well and your channel's growing and all that, where do you want to take this whole thing?
Well, I just got invited to speak at my first conference, which I'm really excited about. It's the College Republicans in, I think, April next month.
Nice.
Yeah, so that'll be my first public speaking thing, which I'm really excited about. Right now, I have a giant list of all these different videos that I'd like to make, all these different people who I'd love to try to get to interviews if I can just hound them enough until they say yes and agree to come on. So yeah, I mean, it's really
I know a little
exciting.
something about that, by the way. Just keep going.
Yeah, just like shoot emails at them left and right is sort of my plan for that. But yeah, I mean, so far YouTube has been really good to me. I can't say enough about, the other creators who have allowed me to do collabs with them or invited me on streams to appear on their channels. So there's, yeah, a lot of fun stuff in the works.
All right, awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm glad we finally connected. And for more on the Roaming Millennial, just put Roaming Millennial in the search bar right above.